Well, it's good to see so many familiar faces in the room. It's not a big industry. So I hope I don't insult anyone's intelligence today, but I'm going to go over some older territory. The views that I'm expressing today are my views, and they may not be everyone's views, but they're based on what I'd call my peculiar and somewhat unique experiences I've had through those inquiries, through the courts, and acting as an expert witness, and through my career. I'll use a lot of examples from different local authorities. I certainly haven't covered every local authority that's represented in this room, and for that I apologise, but they're meant to be as examples. I've got a lot to cover. I'm going to take you on a journey, and the journey comprises of what happened in the 2010-2011 floods. I think you'd have to be crazy not to know that something happened, but just a reminder. I'm talking about post-flood considerations. So what do we start thinking about after those floods? The boring part of the talk's going to be going through some of the key recommendations relative to this group coming out of the floods inquiry, but I think it's worthwhile going through. Then on to what's happened in the last 2 years, and again, that's my view on life, and what further changes may still be required, and finally, key lessons learned. So on with the show. What happened? 98% of all Queensland shires were disaster affected in 2010-2011, either from flooding, cyclone effects, or both. Why were they surprising? There were different types of flooding: long duration rainfall events, embedded short duration flash flooding events. The extent of the floods was extraordinary. North Queensland to the New South Wales border, coastal areas severely affected and inland areas severely affected. Rural areas, rural towns and cities all affected. Sounds like I've got some opposition over there. Flash flooding. As you're all aware, it's a result of short duration intense rainfall. It can often occur in highly developed or steep mountainous areas, such as Murphy's Creek, Lockyer Valley, and in Toowoomba. There's little warning or preparation time from flash flooding. Often it's characterised by high velocities and extreme hazard. And there's a couple of images from Toowoomba and also Lockyer Valley during those flood events. Interesting trying to get a hydraulic model to predict to millimetre accuracy in those conditions. Here's another example from Halidon, which has just happened to be some snaps from one of the properties in the valley as the flooding came down. And from start to finish is 22 minutes, from way down the paddock to way over the roof. Long duration river floods. Well, you think they'd be a bit more manageable and predictable, and in some ways they're predictable, but they're certainly not necessarily manageable. These are some shots from flooding in the Condamine, which is the start of one of the longest river systems in Australia. They really normally result from very long rainfall events. They require more time to prepare and evacuate. There is more time to prepare and evacuate. And this is the sort of flooding that affected places like Western Downs, Dalby, Gundawindi. But they can last for a long period of time, and you've got to deal with it, and you can deal with isolation. A couple more slides from Toowoomba, then I'll move on. Within an hour of the rainfall, the creek had gone up several metres. The flood wave went 6 kilometres in 30 minutes. That's the sort of time that the people had to deal with that flood. There really wasn't time. Pedestrians were caught in their lunch break in a rotunda in the middle of town and couldn't get from the rotunda back across one short drain. It's quite amazing. Compounded by street drainage with 2 to 5 year rainfall design criteria. The end result was what we all saw. Gundawindi dodged a bullet. Gundawindi has a very large levee protection system. This flood was predicted to get to 10.8 metres on the Gundawindi gauge. Luckily, it reached 10.65 because the levee crest at best is 11 metres and it's subject to geotechnical instability and slippage. and at that time the town had not evacuated at the peak. Dalby had 5 separate flood events in a fairly short period of time. The town was inundated over a very wide area. The infrastructure was devastated, including the water treatment plant, which was flooded and non-serviceable. So, ironically, the town was on level 6 water restrictions. I moved to Brisbane flooding. Something like 12,000 houses, 2,500 businesses had above floor flooding. 2,100 roads inundated, 100,000 homes without power. It was the 6th largest flood in recorded history, the January 2011 flood, which tells you something. It's not the largest we can have. Without Wivenhoe, we would have had 2 metre higher flood levels, an additional 14,000 properties affected. So that's a little bit of history, which I'm sure just refreshes the memories. So what happened straight after the floods? We began looking at designing for future floods and thinking a little bit more about it. And clearly there was a need for a review of current standards in many places, a serious review of the design flood events and the flood planning levels, starting to look harder at our national best practice guidelines. SCARM was the guideline in place at that time, and a lot of good material in SCARM. And more importantly, and I think critically, starting to look in more detail in this state at flood risk and risk-based approach, and consideration of things like the probable maximum flood and what land uses are appropriate in various places and what the risk to people and property is. So these were ideas floating around after the floods. And this is one of the reasons why we had to look at these things. This is a typical house in Rocklea, and you'll see the January 2011 level went to over the roof. This was straight out of the Courier Mail, and it was pretty right. So already the existing defined flood level, sure, get this to work or not, there we go. The existing defined flood level was halfway up the building, and we have a flood that goes over the roof. I mean, dealing with that is bad enough, but dealing with that means serious evacuation and risk. This is a new estate in Emerald that went under in 2010, I think it was. And some of the things that were looked at was that there was a lot of historic old planning schemes around that have been around for a long time. For example, Thurrangower used to have a 50-year standard. Johnsonside used to have a standard that related to the fact that they had mainly old Queenslanders where floods would go underneath. But then slab-on-ground houses started appearing in that part of the world, and suddenly they had a fairly major problem. And every 100 years mean it will flood sometime is a message people started to understand. Looking at the risk-based approach, this is some very useful information out of some of the New South Wales guidelines. And an important consideration is if you're somewhere like Tuggerah Lakes, oops, try again. Somewhere like Tuggerah Lakes, if the PMF is only up to your windowsill, you're not going to kill large numbers of people, and your house is unlikely to wash away unless it's a flash flooding situation. If you're somewhere like Bankstown and the PMF is multiple metres over the top of the roof, you've got some serious planning considerations and serious risk to life and property. Another thing that came out of these floods were places like Moggill, Balbarry, where people were isolated for long periods of time during the floods, and it took a long time for them to get access after the floods. And a terminology was invented by the Floods Commission of Inquiry called anthill developments, which was kind of quaint. It wasn't an industry standard one, but it's what's stuck. And they are what you would describe as anthill developments. They've got low-level accesses. They've been planned generally above the planning horizon, and they go under in a probable maximum flood. And that is really problematic, because you have issues with services, you have issues with medical supplies and people's needs during floods. Food supply is an issue. Really, you need high-level access roads under those environments. And there's been a lot of work done, not in the engineering or scientific field, but in the mental health area, with the effects of floods and isolation on people. since the floods. And of course, there's additional strain on emergency services because of all the additional people at risk. I'm moving on to the recommendations of the inquiry, and unfortunately this is a little bit boring, this bit, but what I've done is I've gone through all the recommendations and pulled out the ones that are particularly applicable to the Stormwater Industry Association, in my view. So they're all the headings that were written in the final report of the floods inquiry, and there's a whole heap of them. And I'm not covering every one of those, thank goodness, everyone says. Floodplain management. What this is about is Brisbane City, Ipswich, Somerset councils, that is the Brisbane River catchment, should complete a new flood study. And as of within the last couple of weeks, the final stage of the technical studies has been let, the hydraulic study for the Brisbane River, and it's taken that long. A recent flood study should be available for use in floodplain management in every urban area in Queensland. I used to work with the Dutch for years and years, and I used to get the Dutch guys come over and they'd open up a piece of software that we were using and say, where in Australia are we on this map? So I can zoom in onto the flood model. And they were aghast when we didn't have a flood model of the entire country. We don't even have contour mapping over, at an appropriate level over large chunks of the country. So it was quite an eye-opener. Council in floodplain areas should develop comprehensive floodplain management plans, working with best practice principles. Sounds pretty sensible. For urban areas where development is expected to occur, councils with requisite resources should develop a flood map that shows zones of risk. Where they don't have resources, they should at least produce a flood map that shows the extent of floods for a range of likelihoods, ARI events, at least 3. So even your small country towns have suddenly got a fairly onerous burden on them to produce this mapping. These are shires with limited resources in many places. On to Chapter 4. There was recommendations to improve the SPP 1/03 state planning policy, and that has happened, and I'll get to that later. Council should consider using limited development zone in their planning schemes for high risk, very high risk areas. That is, the term prohibition springs to mind, is one method of dealing with that. Councils should in model floodplain planning controls have a requirement for a flood overlay map, identifying areas that are not affected by flood, that are affected by flood, on which planning controls can be applied, for which there is no flood information available. The government should consider drafting assessment criteria to be included in flood modelling controls that do not reduce on-site flood storage capacity. Basically, ensure that there's no adverse impact. Do not change the flood characteristics. Again, no loss of storage, no change in flow patterns, no acceleration or retardation of flows, or reduction in warning time. And consider the prospect of isolation or hindrance to evacuation. These are a lot of new controls when you consider what was in the planning schemes and the broad things that are in the state planning policy before the 2011 floods in Queensland, and of course the impact of isolation or hindered evacuation. What were they recommending for development assessment in practice? Councils should maintain flood maps and overland flow path maps for use in development assessment. These should be based on hydraulic modelling for urban areas, and they should be readily updatable. Common theme, old models, old data, out of date, not keeping up with what's actually happening. More importantly, this recommendation says those maps have to be made available to applicants and also their consultants. And there has been a huge change in what state and local governments have been doing since the floods in terms of release of data. Just look at the LIDAR data you can get from the state now. It covers a very large chunk of the state that wasn't available previously. This is a very important criteria that was set by the Floods Commission of Inquiry and has a fairly big effect on what local authorities can do in their planning schemes. Council should not rely on a condition requiring an evacuation plan as the sole basis for approving a development susceptible to flooding. So you can't just rely on evacuation. Because what I saw sitting through days and days of testimony in the floods inquiry is people do unexpected things. People do not always follow evacuation plans. They do not follow radio warnings. They do not follow orders to evacuate. Someone somewhere doesn't do what you'd expect a normal human being to do. And that means you've got a plan for that. There were some lessons in the essential services area. All councils should map overland flow paths. Very few had mapped overland flow paths, yet they can take essential services out. Councils should also look at locating essential services above basement level or waterproofing the basements, basically. And they should conduct risk assessments to identify the risk of backflow flooding, such as the Mogglebell barrier cases, and to try and manage that with a risk assessment. And the government should prepare criteria for critical infrastructure to remain operational during floods. I did say this section was pretty boring, but there's a lot of these recommendations. This is about less than a fifth of the total recommendations. In terms of emergency response and other interim report issues, council should encourage businesses to develop their own flood evacuation plans in areas known to be affected by flood, and this is largely to do with existing businesses, and provide information about the benefits of those plans and provide information to help them liaise with emergency services in the preparation of those plans, and also to assist them with those plans. Right, now on to something more interesting. So that was a lot of recommendations and a lot of words about what should happen based on a court environment and lawyers writing recommendations, which then needed to flow down through to implementation. So what's actually happened in the last 2 years? Quite a lot, really. Firstly, we've had a new single state planning policy. Love it or hate it, it's a change, and it has attempted to address the recommendations of the flood inquiry. We've had a number of temporary local government planning instruments, and they were put in pretty much as a stopgap measure after the floods. And now we're seeing a rollout of new planning schemes. And this is where I need to be careful I don't offend any local authorities, but we certainly got a new one in Sunshine Coast. Brisbane's is coming out 1st of July. Gold Coast is well advanced. It's coming out next year, I think, if I've got it right. And there's a whole heap of others that are fairly well advanced, and the whole state ultimately will have new planning schemes. And we've got new national best practice guidelines. So there has been progress. I spent a lot of time in court trying to defend refusals of developments in bad places. And this policy is something that I still see as being helpful, because what it says is developments avoid natural hazard areas or mitigate the risks of natural hazard, and implicit in that is mitigate to an appropriate level. Supports and does not unduly burden disaster management, response and recovery capacity and capabilities, and doesn't worsen the natural hazard, and avoids risk to public safety and the environment. And I mean, that's a pretty useful set of overriding principles in any consideration of development. The devil's always in the details, of course, and whilst it's a nice thin state planning policy, all the guidelines are very, very voluminous and haven't all been tested. Moving on to the temporary planning instruments, this is an example of one. This is an Ipswich temporary planning instrument. And what Ipswich did is, after the 2011 floods, they adopted a position where the highest of the 1974 or the 2011 flood was the defined flood event, and then they mapped the city with those floods. And that is what's been used subsequently and to date for any new development applications in Ipswich. Brisbane similarly put in a new temporary local planning instrument, and it was based on the mapped 2011 levels or the Q100, I think, whichever was higher in the fine print. And the critical thing there is setting habitable floor levels and ground levels for development related to that temporary planning horizon relating to the 2011 floods. And there were many more. New local government planning schemes. I'll take a little bit of time with this. I've used the Gold Coast one as an example. I've been having a good look at the new Brisbane plan. I've had a fair bit of input into the Brisbane plan in the new flood code, for want of a better term, or flood overlay. And it's the first time Brisbane's had a combined flood code. Previously, all the flooding provisions were spread over several codes: filling and excavation code, stormwater management code, waterway code, to mention a few. And it's good to see that it's actually all been wrapped up. And like Gold Coast, it has a lot more emphasis on risk. Critical elements of the Gold Coast draft scheme: all developments must not detrimentally affect the flood storage capacity of the catchment. So again, this underlying theme of flood storage preservation. Death by 1,000 cuts, they call it. Cumulative impact. Those terminology is getting widespread and used more and more. And I'm doing a talk next week for the Planning Institute of Australia, and one of the things I've looked at there is some of the case law of late and some of the judgments that have been handed down, and this is one of the underlying principles that the courts are now supporting very strongly. Secondly, developments in flood-affected areas must not cause or have the cumulative potential to cause, interesting phraseology, damage must not increase the level of risk to life or be to the detriment of flood evacuation procedures. So there's a hell of a lot in that clause, and it requires a lot of careful consideration to comply with that in terms of flooding. The third one I've pulled out relates to flood storage and conveyance again. Development must allow for the maintenance of flood storage and flood conveyance of flood and drainage channels and overland flow paths. And that is typical of many of the new schemes coming out, that new development has to comply with these requirements. And bearing in mind we've now had this provision of having to map overland flow paths, it's now got to the point that some of these provisions are sneaking through in overland flow considerations. For example, the new Brisbane plan has a combined section that deals with overland flow paths as well as waterway corridors and treats them the same way. All proposed development must demonstrate that sufficient access or egress will be available to enable evacuation during a range of floods. Now, would you have seen that in a planning scheme 5 years ago? The old Marucci scheme is a good example. When arguing in relation to a recent appeal, which was Stocklands versus Sunshine Coast Council, I argued for the council that emergency floodplain management was absolutely fundamental to that development because it was isolated in the floodplain. But the Marucci scheme was quite old, that covered that area, and there was absolutely nothing in it to provide assistance. But fortunately, precedents in court, the floods inquiry, the 2011 floods all had an influence that flood emergency management considerations were a factor taken into account in the judgment. This is the other thing that's changing. A recognition that the 1 in 100 isn't the be-all and end-all. Gold Coast have set disaster management facility requirements to be at the 1 in 500 year level. You'll be surprised when you look around Brisbane even, how many of the emergency response centres are in the bottom of gullies and flood affected. There's one near me at Newmarket. So they've got all sandbags that you can pick up when it floods, and it'd be one of the first places that goes out. And it's just historic how it's happened. The main SES headquarters on Kedron Brook for years had a major flood problem. So don't put your disaster centres where it floods. Hospitals, a requirement for a 500 year immunity. Seems pretty sensible, but I'll come to that a little later. Substations, that was one of the really major things that stopped the CBD of Brisbane for a long period of time after the 2011 floods, because all the substations for the high-rises were in the basements, all went underwater, and with that and lift services resulted in the longest delays in getting some of those high-rises operational, and it was months and months and months. Food storage warehouses, 200-year event, and they're just a few I've highlighted. So suddenly there's a realisation that we need to have a higher standard for some things. And these sort of numbers, not necessarily always the same, but these sort of numbers are in a number of new schemes and draft new schemes. Onto the new National Best Practice Guidelines. This is a really good document. I'd recommend you all read it at some stage. It's put out by the Federal Government, Australian Emergency Management Institute, and it updates SCARM, and it has a lot of really nice material in it. And it does reflect current best practice, which I think is something that we should aspire to in our developments. And this is a really nice part of that book that I like. It's one of the chapters that says how we treat flood risk for future development. And what it says is managing flood risk to new development is essential to limiting the growth of flood risk. So it recognises in one sentence that we already have major flood risk. The sins of the past. We've got flood affected properties, we built next to rivers, we built in floodplains. Let's not make it worse. We've got to manage it with any new development. And the need to maintain flood function, consider flood hazard and develop sustainable emergency response arrangements. So again, all those things, the emergency response comes into it. And this rather neat little diagram, and there's several of these in this book, if you haven't seen it. Isn't it interesting? We've got a 100-year line, we're mapping the PMF. We're actually mapping these high hazard areas and recognising that they are high hazard in planning or in development assessment. We're recognising where the access roads are and where they get cut. And of course, an adjunct to that is when they get cut in a flood and at what stage. And finally, you put your emergency centres beyond the flood. I worked on a storm surge inundation study for Hervey Bay quite a few years ago now, and it was fantastic. We had all this wonderful mapping, worked out when roads were going under. Virtually every evacuation centre in Hervey Bay would be wiped out in the design events that we were planning for. And they weren't cyclone proof either. I think we've come a long way since then. Got plenty of time. Areas where further change may still be required. Well, I've already mentioned infrastructure standards for hospitals, and I'm sure you remember what happened in Cairns-based hospital during Yasi. Cairns Hospital is right on the Esplanade, Abbott Street in Cairns. The foreshore park in front has something like a 10-year storm tide immunity. The CBD of Cairns drainage system has probably a 10-year immunity. And we've got a major regional hospital right there. And evacuating sick people during the middle of that type of event is not desirable. But we're still putting hospitals in places that are not to the highest standard. And the new Sunshine Coast Hospital is an example of that. It's not all that immune. Food supply. Rockley markets, severely flooded in 2011, were devastated. Rockley Markets has reopened. It's a very, very difficult nut to crack in terms of flood-proofing that site because it's surrounded by flood-affected properties. You can't levy it, you can't fill it. You could put it on stilts, but it costs a fortune. Access is then an issue anyway in a flood. It needs to be somewhere else, but that requires long-term planning. The other interesting thing we found investigating for the floods inquiry for some of the Western Downs, for example, areas, is the run on food that took place with these long duration floods and completely cleaned out all the grocery stores, just nothing left. And that's an issue. Dalby was even more complicated because their main shopping centre went completely under in terms of the basement, which had all the services in, and they didn't have a major shopping centre for 6 months, I think, roundabouts. It took them to get that back online. Water treatment plants, well, they need to be at a high level because we rely on our water supply. We've talked about power. During the 2011 floods, my daughter was still a student at university working in the TransLink call centre, except she couldn't get to work to help people, tell them what bus to catch or what facilities were still running because the call centre went underwater. Police vehicles. This was a police storage area that went completely underwater. Just a waste. Look at our road networks. Virtually every major highway was cut for extended periods of time, some worse than others. Ipswich motorway has had a major upgrade, but it will still be cut in an event like that. Bruce Highway, well, there's a lot of money talked about upgrading the Bruce Highway, but there are sections of the Bruce Highway that still don't have 20-year standard. Some places probably don't even have 10. There were huge rail outages, and rail is particularly susceptible to flooding because it washes out the ballast, and once that's done, the alignment of the rails is just completely hatted, and it takes a long time to reconstruct rail lines. Airports flooded. That's Rockhampton Airport. It was closed for 3 weeks. It had fairly severe limitations on pavement because of pavement issues on what planes could land there after that. And there's been a major review of flood immunity come out of that in an effort to try and give better flood protection. This is Cairns Airport. Kansas Airport, something I've been involved in for probably 30 years. And like many airports, it was built on mangrove land or salt flats. Bowen's another good example of a little salt flat airport. And it got bigger, and it grew from a little country airport into a big city airport and an international airport. Unfortunately, it's right next to the Barron Delta. And the Barron Delta has regular flooding. So to protect the airport, a major levee system was built, and it has pump drainage. But unfortunately, because of the flight approach requirements and because of the proximity of the river, this bit of the levee bank here has a 1 in 38 year immunity. So the whole lot goes under in a 1 in 38 year event. Well, that's what it was last time I looked at it, and they haven't changed that. That's still there. If that goes out, that's a regional facility of major importance. So moving on to key lessons learned. What did we learn from all this? What have we learned from the 2011 floods? What have we learned from the floods inquiry? What have we learned from the reviews that have gone on? What have our town planners thought about and the engineers who put input into those town plans? Have we come anywhere? Personally, I think that floodplain development requirements will never be the same in Queensland as it was before. It's changed, and it's changed for the better. Flood modelling and mapping is required for all significant development in floodplains. Trying to do it without that information is just hopeless. And that leads to all sorts of challenges because there are huge tracts of Queensland that have no decent topography mapping and very little resources for providing that information. You go to places like St George and the lower Ballon system, Dirranbandi, places like that, massive cotton developments with massive levee banks. And in the past, there's been very little controls over those things, and yet to control that sort of development requires quite sophisticated models. But you've got these little country towns that don't have, 1, the finances, 2, the technical expertise, and 3, the political will, probably, given their composition, to actually deal with it. So it's a major challenge. But it's one that's now enshrined in terms of the state planning policy, which rides on the back of the floods inquiry recommendations. So there is hope. But the challenge coming out of that is, we're not like Holland, we're not the most densely populated country in Europe. We don't have all that population base to pay for the survey, to pay for the flood work, to pay for the flood protection works. And fortunately, we're not 2/3 below sea level as well, so that's a plus. But it's a challenge. We're a big state, we've got a lot of areas to cover, but these are requirements that are now set down that we need to deal with. Planning levels for flooding need to be reviewed regularly based on recent flooding events and refined flood modelling. I mean, that's really easy to say, but in practice, that's extremely difficult for local authorities to deal with because, for example, when Gold Coast was really booming about 10 years ago, they would be getting probably 150, 200 applications for development in the Hope Island area alone in 1 year. And you get progressive approvals and things are getting built and things are changing, but the flood model isn't. And then the flood model has to try and catch up. And that is a real challenge dealing with that. If you've only got a couple, you can plug them in occasionally and update your models. And it's something that I know Sunshine Coast is grappling with at the moment, how to deal with that issue, to keep the models reliable. Consideration must be given to the risks and consequences of floods greater than the defined flood event up to the PMF. I know I'll sound really old when I say this. When I started engineering and started in hydraulics, the standard that Main Roads had was a 50-year standard based on an extremely long overland flow path length, and really it wasn't a 50-year standard, it was sort of a 20-year standard. And over the years there's been some absolute classic disasters where duplications have occurred and they built to the old standard but with a new alignment. So in the old standard they had culverts built for road alignment that went down and then came up and went across. They stuck in the culverts, 50-year doesn't overtop, it's all good. Put in a new road, we're not doing that, we're doing that. Suddenly you've got a 3-4 metre dam with insufficient capacity for larger floods. Brisbane City Council used to have a 20-year standard and look no further. And again, because of the long duration overland flow path considerations that were implicit in the rules, it really wasn't a 20-year standard. And that type of standard led to building trunk drainage in the gullies because that was the best and most efficient place to put it. We've moved on from that, but we've still got a long way to go, and this is another quantum leap. The whole term PMF, you talk to councillors around the state, and I talk to a lot of country councillors, and they just think that this event is so extreme that it's ridiculous to be planning for it. And you've got to put it in terms of risk and risk considerations. And that then comes down to things like the Australian standard for risk considerations and putting it on a scale. What is societal risk levels that we want to accept? And that's an exceedingly difficult thing to answer. You can compare it against the chance of getting struck by lightning, dying in a flood. You can compare it against the statistics of dying on a road. And that's been done, and it's been argued in a number of court cases by a new breed of risk specialists that are out there. But in the end, society is the people who make the determination on what's an acceptable level of risk, and as engineers and scientists, all we can do is put the numbers up. But in my view, if there is a serious risk of loss of life, that's too much risk. It needs to be considered all the way to the PMF. Risk assessment for people and property and risk management are integral components of any plan for development. This includes emergency flood management. And time and time and time again, you see new development proposals that have been drawn up by a planner or a surveyor, and then you start retrofitting the constraints like flooding constraints. And it used to be, well, we're losing lots from day one because of your flooding constraints. Now it's even worse because you can get to the point where you deal with the flooding up to the defined flood event, and then suddenly you realise that you've got a development that builds out into a floodplain that's quite steep, that can have metres of difference between a 100-year flood and a PMF, and there's nowhere for people to go. You can't evacuate, you can't plan for it, you can't retrofit an emergency plan. It needs to be considered at step one. So it's a quantum change in thinking in the way you look at developments. Start with the constraints, and from flooding, there are at least those two. what's the safe level to put people at and how do we convey the water through? Secondly, if you get a bigger event, how do you get people out? And I really like this one. I've used this in court a lot and sustained quite severe cross-examination because of this. But because the floods inquiry put this as a recommendation, I think it's a fundamental. You cannot rely on evacuation alone. You have to have other means. And other means usually means early actions or refuge actions or integration with regional emergency planning. Emergency flood planning for larger developments should be done at an early stage of project planning with provision of suitable evacuation routes and, where necessary, community refuge shelter facilities. Now, this isn't your 10-lot subdivision. That's not going to work. It's got to be big enough to be sustainable. It's got to be big enough that the community can afford those sort of facilities. It's got to be big enough that the developer can afford those sort of facilities. And if it doesn't work, quite frankly, the development shouldn't be there. Egress routes out of a floodplain must be to a suitable standard. Sounds pretty straightforward, but by geez, the number of developments you see where they build up to 100-year and have decent internal roads, but the external roads go out early in a flood at a drop of a hat. Critical services and infrastructure needs to be able to withstand extreme flood events. It seems a no-brainer, and yet it took those floods to learn that. Anthill or island development ought to be discouraged, as should development in high-risk areas. We shouldn't be encouraging people to go into those places. We're not Holland. We don't have to develop very, very difficult areas. We have other land. The risk to people from all possible floods must always be considered if we are to avoid the terrible loss of life that occurred in the 2011 floods. And that's the message of the day. That's the difference. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions for Neil? I'll have a microphone, so if anyone wants to use a microphone, I'll pass it to you. Any takers?
Hi Neil, Alton from City of Gold Coast. Our new flood maps don't really show the defined event or the 100-year event. It just says that if you are within the blue map, you should refer to the flood code, or you should meet the requirements of the flood code. What's your, I guess, professional opinion of that? Would that be suitable enough, or because we don't want the flood maps to be used for insurance or emergency evacuations? It's just for planning purpose.
Well, the Gold Coast scheme and the current scheme is what I'm referring to, has for a long time been fairly advanced in the way it deals with flooding risk. And that methodology of an overlay map is required under the current planning legislation. And I would say that the way the Gold Coast plan works is that it's adequate because it triggers you to go look at something else. And in the case of Gold Coast, there's models in just about every major waterway, which is the next layer down. But I find it frustrating at times with politicians that there is the resources to do quite detailed mapping these days, and there's this reluctance to go public with the mapping, because what invariably happens when you put fine scale maps is you put them on public exhibition and everyone will go look to where they live and say, that's not right, it doesn't do that, your mapping's wrong, something's wrong, and you're also going to mean I don't get insurance, etc., etc. So there's a whole heap of other things that hang off that. And maybe that is an issue with the insurance industry, but I think that's the insurance industry's issue, not the physics of what's actually going on. And the one thing I have learnt over the years is if you're doing best practice, if you're providing the best possible information to the public, that's the best service we can do to them. But invariably, we work in a system where we have politicians who determine at what level that information is released, and that's the system we live with. In New South Wales for years it was mandatory to provide those flood maps. Mandatory. But they seem to have been doing some fiddling with that in the last few years as well, in places anyway.
David Simpson. Neil, you've shown us that there are recommendations that flood storage needs to be preserved. I would consider that's probably one of the most difficult things. Can you explain how that would occur in practice?
Yeah, I can. It depends on the type of floodplain too. If you're at the mouth of a river and your storm tide dominated, that consideration seems kind of pointless, and that needs to be rationalised in development assessments. If you're in a broad flat floodplain like the Merrimack-Carrara, it's like a large detention basin that only has so much capacity. So every little spoonful of dirt in it eventually eats away at that capacity, and if you're not careful, the water levels will go up and you'll worsen downstream flooding with increased flows. In practice, how it works is generally, and it varies a little from local authority to local authority, generally there's a balance at the Q100 level. Often there's checks at lower ARI levels, and rarely is there consideration of greater than the 100 other than for catastrophic considerations. Now, Townsville's got a draft planning scheme out where, for a lot of good reasons, on the Ross River, there's need for consideration of what happens in the 500-year event. I won't bore you with details, but Wes can fill you in if you're not familiar with what's happening there. And there's really good reasons for it there. So they're actually looking at more extreme events, but most local authorities are only looking for balance of flood storage up to the 100. Brisbane has a requirement in the guidelines and also the compensatory earthworks planning scheme policy to look at a whole range, and also to look at catastrophic effects on larger events. Because the risk is you can do a development that complies up to the 100, and if you have something that's much, much larger, through development, creeks can move, and that's happened. And you're aware of some, I'm sure, in Brisbane, where creeks have moved. You want to avoid those sort of things. Major movements, major catastrophic damage, and that sort of checking. In upper reach areas of streams that are steep, flood storage really is neither here nor there, because it's a conveyance-dominated world, and you're not really looking at filling into steep, fast-flowing, flash flooding environments, so it really doesn't apply in those cases. But most of our bigger cities are based on floodplains, e.g. Bundaberg, Mackay, Cairns to a lesser extent, all of them, Rockhampton, all of them are on floodplains that flood storage is a consideration, because there is property that is downstream that can be adversely affected. And if you chew up the flood storage, you'll worsen flooding downstream.
Wouldn't that mean that that severely restricts any future development in those cities and towns?
It does. In the Merrimack-Carrara, there used to be a rough rule of thumb, a third, and you'd end up with a third development if you're really lucky. And that's in a situation where the ground levels were between 1.5 and 2 metres AHD, and the flood level was between 4.5 and 5, so it was a lot of filling. In essence, a lot of those ones ended up with only 10 or 15% of site area. And then you put an overlay on top of that of emergency flood management, and it becomes very challenging indeed, which is why big chunks of the Merrimack-Carrara still have not developed. And the other overlay there, of course, is the existing flood-affected properties risk, and the risk of developing new properties leading to adverse impacts, which then leads to the potential for class actions. And we are in a very litigious society these days. And it only takes a few hundred, perhaps, potential claimants to get one of those things rolling. If it's only 2 or 3 houses, I think the lawyers aren't overly interested, but once you get to a few hundred, you start having serious potential for that sort of action, and local authorities are very mindful of that these days.
Is that the reason why Grantham was relocated?
Well, I could only speculate on why Grantham was relocated, but Grantham was a disaster waiting to happen with the benefit of hindsight. But there is certainly movement for class action from the people of Grantham. There's been Morris Blackburn have been considering launching a class action, but I don't think it's been launched yet. That was both in relation to the floods themselves, but also the failure of a large sandpit dam in Grantham that led to an alleged early flood wave before the main flood.
When was the last major disaster in Toowoomba prior to the last one that really took
Don't know that I know the answer to that. I looked at the history of why it is what it is, and it all revolved around the rail, which is what a lot of our towns revolved around. So they set up the rail line in the middle of Townsville, right next to the main creek, for all sorts of reasons, steam trains, for example. And the town sort of just literally grew from that. And because it grew from that, there was a lot of development pressure around the town. So they started filling in, and Gary Creek is basically channelized and really tight. So when you look at the flood mapping in Grantham, the number of properties affected by a 100-year flood, for example, isn't that many, because it's quite steep. So from a flood risk, flood mitigation viewpoint, you don't get a lot of return in terms of gain for what you spend on flood mitigation, so it's sort of gone under the radar. But I don't think I can recall flooding of that sort before. And one of the things that you remind me of is the sort of rain that occurred in that event was pretty extraordinary. I mean, that rain gauge that was above Murphy's Creek, based on the analysis of long-term records, they're not that long, it was several thousand-year ARI, one of the rain gauges. It was just a mind-boggling event. And the water wasn't flowing just down the creek. It was actually flowing 1.5 metre deep sheet flow down the hills and along the roads. And I've seen where it came down and washed cars away halfway up the hill. It's just a mind-boggling event. It was very skewed, but the bit that tipped on top of the range, and I'm sure others here have their views on this too, it was extreme in some areas. So that might be why that hasn't been seen before. But the capacity of the system is quantified. It's not very good. It's just the risk of an extreme event and the benefits of flood mitigation, or the limited benefits of flood mitigation in terms of affected houses and premises that would get a benefit, never stacked up from a flood mitigation point of view, I suspect. You have a different view, or sound about right?
Neil, Steve Rosso from Moreton Bay Regional Council. Neil, do you have any thoughts on how we can perhaps be a bit smarter about establishing freeboard requirements for our planning controls? Or do we just simply use 500 millimetres or 300 millimetres because other councils do that?
Oh, that's a good question. Freeboard is such an interesting concept. It's like we did our best guess and then we're just plugging something else on to make us feel better. But it's an important something else add-on. And we've gone from, in the days gone by, 150, 200 millimetres freeboard to pretty universally 300, and now finally waking up that major river systems, there's more uncertainty, so maybe 500. When you're in steep catchments with flash flooding, 500 freeboard is inadequate because it doesn't take much for it to change levels enormously. So my view on freeboard is there needs to be a sliding scale based on the type of catchment you're in. And if you're down at Hemmant, 500 mil freeboard's probably way too much. But I don't think there's any reason to relax it, because the one thing that has happened universally over my career is every estimate of design flows only goes in one way. And of course, we've also had the benchmark changes. What's the societal acceptance level on flooding? Well, we used to think it was 20 years, and 50 years, fantastic, it's the 100-year. Of course, as they discovered in the States after all those big Mississippi floods and some of the other big disasters with the hurricanes, major infrastructure needs higher design life. And you go to some of the marine codes in Australia, for example, designing for ports, and the ports routinely look at 200-year design life, 200-year return periods. And they use another methodology which I think has enormous merit and is not used widely enough, which is encounter probability, which puts into perspective the design life of what you're looking at relative to the return period of an event and the likelihood of it occurring. And you can Google it and it even comes up with a little calculator on screen for you if you want to know what it is. 50-year design life, 100-year event, what's the probability? And it's very high. You're going to get one. It's a pretty good chance. You put in a 50-year design life and a 10-year return period, it's even more scary. So that is something that the port guys have been doing for years, and I think it needs to flow into this industry to put it into perspective. If you're doing a sandpit that's going to be around for 5 years, sorry, Steve. Doing a sandpit that's going to be around for 5 years, the 100-year event has less relevance than it does if you're putting a housing estate there that might be there for 100 years. So those things come into it as well as freeboard. But you're right. I mean, I'd be interested in your views on what you think about freeboard, and we can have that discussion. But I'm with you. It's one number doesn't fit all, and it's an interesting concept in the first place because you really need to know the absolute level of risk that you're putting people at to make informed decisions.
I think also from the photos you showed earlier, Neil, we've got the turbulent flows in Toowoomba, 500 mil freeboard on top of supercritical flows, a bit of rubbish.
One of the really interesting things and one of the really distressing things I got to do in that floods inquiry was to see some of the CCTV footage that didn't make it to air because I acted for Toowoomba Council through LGAQ. And we're talking about people evacuating and human behaviour. I have never seen such acts of lunacy in my life. At one stage there were these guys driving four-wheel drive utes, and you can go anywhere when you've got a four-wheel drive ute obviously, went down a hill past a swiftwater rescue team who were rescuing people with this sheet flow of 1.5 metres coming down the hill, crossed them and then tried to cross the main creek. First guy made it across, second guy got sort of stuck, and the third guy kept coming. Luckily they didn't get washed off. I don't know how they got away with it. And then at the height of the flood there was a guy with an umbrella trying to walk across, hanging onto the handrail, not far from where that standing wave was, because he wanted to get home. It's just people do extraordinary things in floods. I could tell you 100 stories like that. I didn't believe some of them until I actually saw them in the witness box talking. It was just mind-boggling. Not everyone thinks like engineers, I'm afraid.
Chris Catalano from Water Technology. Just a quick answer to Steve's question. I think you can max your parameters out in your model, and that'll give you an idea of which areas are fluctuating highly and which areas are not. Max out your roughness, max out your hydrologic parameters and all those sorts of things. That wasn't the question I had though. The question I had was, one thing I've seen with the flood storage thing is the unfortunate byproduct, and that happens on the Gold Coast, is dooming the existing residents into not being able to fill themselves out of the poo, so to speak. And I think that does a disservice to the community. You know, so do you have any...
Well, funny you should mention the Gold Coast because I think they might be having a good look at that at the moment. On infill, on smaller lot. It's a really difficult question. I mean, one of the appeals I'm actively involved in at the moment's a major shopping centre proposed just south of Maroochy Airport. And it's an infill development. It requires a lot of filling to get it out of the flood level. It's surrounded by flood-affected properties. But the impacts on the flooding alone are not all that large. But you've just got to be so careful with infill because you're going to worsen flooding just by a little bit. And if there's enough flood-affected properties, the incremental damage can be quite large. So they're the most difficult cases, I think. And their flood storage becomes a very complicated issue because it can be argued that it's a one-off. There isn't going to be cumulative effect. So then you can't argue about millimetres adding up to several hundred millimetres. It's really quite difficult.
Danny Lee from Humes, just picking up on your point you just made about the Maroochy job. What's the situation in Queensland regarding compensatory excavation if you're going to infill?
That depends on individual planning schemes. At the moment, the Maroochy plant, which is the the Marucci plan is still relevant to that appeal because it relates to the date of the application, and it alludes to no loss of floodplain storage and doesn't differentiate between infill and broad scale or greenfield type development. So it's still a live issue in that case. Some areas of planning schemes are trying to go to the sophistication of differentiating between greenfield and infill, and I think it's uncharted territories in terms of potential conflicts and appeals. It can be done. As I said, Gold Coast has got a project at the moment where they're looking at potentially making it more reasonable for people to develop, on existing areas that are flood affected. But it requires a huge amount of effort in terms of analysis to make sure you're not going to come up with a decision that's going to leave council with a liability and a potential class action next time it floods. So they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. I mean, the other end of the spectrum that's always pushing is affordable housing. And all the development industries are push that all the time. Affordable housing, affordable homes, affordable living, help people, help your kids. And that's a very valid point, so long as you don't put them at unreasonable risk.
Neil, just one more comment. A method to possibly go back to better utilisation of our land is, wouldn't it be, as our foreparents did, building houses on elevated floors rather than slabs?
I think there's certainly some merit in that, but I think there's a reluctance to go that way because of the affordable housing argument. Those sort of houses seem to be expensive, but others might know better. The other way it can be done, and it is being done in some places, is through planning scheme changes, push the population centre somewhere else. And I need to be careful what I say here because it's up for state government interest check at the moment. But one of the western shires has a draft planning scheme that discourages growth over a very large area that was severely flood affected in 2010-2011 floods, and encourages growth, new growth, well south of the town, southeast of it, which would be to the detriment of existing areas in the north. And there are a number of appeals running at the moment before the new scheme comes in, trying to safeguard that position against redevelopment in the north. And so that's probably enough clues, so if you were smart, you can figure out where it is if you go looking. And that is really radical stuff, but it's necessary stuff. That's a bit like move your town. And that's the other way to deal with it. If there's more land available that doesn't have such a major constraint, why don't we use it? Get out of these really high-risk areas. That's long-term vision sort of stuff required for that.
Time for one more question. Any more questions? Look for someone down the back. We haven't had many questions down the back, so... No? Well, it looks like as a state we've got a much bigger job than what I realised anyway. And so I think, look, we'd like to thank you on behalf of Stormwater Queensland and all its members. Thank you for that presentation, Neil. And look, we do have a gift for you, but unfortunately, my mistake, I left that behind. So I'll deliver it personally to your office, mate. That's all right. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. I just hope it was of interest.